Welcome to the Lott Carey Pilgrimages of Striving and Thriving podcast. I'm Reverend Dr. Jacqueline Madison McQuarrie, pastor of the First Baptist Church of New Market in Piscataway, New Jersey, and learning coordinator for Pilgrimages of Striving and Thriving. The Pilgrimages of Striving and Thriving weekly podcast grows from a multi-year journey among pastors committed to flourishing in ministry. This is a project of the Lott Carey Foreign Mission Society and is made possible through the generous support from the Lilly Endowment. Learn more about Lott Carey and how it helps churches to extend the Christian witness throughout the world at lottcarey.org. That's LOTTCAREY.org. Join us for weekly conversations with pastoral thought leaders who share wisdom from the Black church for the whole church. Let's join Reverend Dr. David Emmanuel Goatley, Associate Dean for Vocational Formation and Christian Witness at Duke Divinity School, and the Project Director for Lott Carey's Pilgrimages of Striving and Thriving. This week, he's in conversation with Reverend Dr. Clifford A. Jones, Sr., pastor of the Friendship Missionary Baptist Church in Charlotte, North Carolina.
We rejoice to welcome Dr. Clifford A. Jones, Sr., the lead pastor of the Friendship Missionary Baptist Church in Charlotte, North Carolina, as we have conversation in our Pilgrimages of Striving and Thriving podcast. Dr. Jones, we really do appreciate you making time to have conversation with us today about flourishing in ministry.
Well, I'm honored and grateful, and hope I can add something to what you're striving to do as it relates to ministry, and not only at striving and thriving, but I've been intrigued by your word flourishing. You have yoked three verbs and adjectives and things together that are all action words: thriving, striving, flourishing, all the key words that I think one would want and desire as it pertains to ministry.
Well, thanks for picking up on that. And we've been on a journey for a few years with two cohorts. One cohort is a cohort of women pastors, and the other is a cohort of millennial and zennial pastors. And what we've been doing is talking about flourishing in ministry includes both striving and thriving. Every round does not go higher and higher. And we've used a metaphor in some of our conversations about ministry like a tree, where sometimes there are just leaves, sometimes there are blossoms, sometimes the leaves are falling away, and sometimes there are only bare branches, but still that tree can be healthy and thriving. So that's one way we've been thinking about in ministry. You've been in ministry for several decades and have been a pastor that's made a lot of impact in the United States and around the world. Could you describe for us something of what flourishing in ministry looks like to you?
Flourishing, to me, is a person engaged in a calling, and I deliberately want to use that word, calling, to serve the Lord Jesus Christ. And for me, it's been in the context of one, the Christian church, and then denominationally. Flourishing, one of those words where there's an expectation. If you're flourishing, it's supposed to be blossoms and fruit, and not only leaves, but blossoms and strong branches and fruit on the tree. But in the context of ministry, flourishing does not always produce blossoms or leaves. And fruit is seasonal. But so often we serve under that pretense that fruit on a particular tree or in this particular ministry is year round. But the tree has to be nurtured at its base in order for it to flourish on its branches and its limbs and leaves, and if it is a fruit-bearing tree, to have fruit. And so I think too often we, as church persons, we're looking at the big and the glit and the glimmer, but not spending enough due diligence with the roots and the base and the core of the tree. It's because of the sap that everything happens in the tree, and that has to be nurtured. And that comes back to the word that you used of context, that one cannot ignore context, and one should be very careful in defining a flourishing ministry in comparative to another ministry contextually. I had the opportunity to serve a very, very small church, a rural church on a dirt road, about 25 members on a good Sunday. And they were all family and friends. And that was a flourishing little church, but no one, who would want to go to, here I am, college trained, seminary trained, and who would want to be stuck there? How'd you end up there? But it was a flourishing church, flourishing in the sense they were alive spiritually. They had a desire within their context to do mission. Nothing globally. They paid their associational dues and a little bit of money to the state convention, but they were proud as punch of the ministry at that church.
Thriving and flourishing requires some striving and struggling, and not mutually exclusive. From your experience as a pastor and a mentor and teacher of other pastors, is that something that you see as normative or not, that there's both striving and thriving and flourishing, that they all can coexist?
I like scripture, Ephesians 4:12, when Paul says, we wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities, against rulers of darkness, against spiritual wickedness in high places, that in the whole structuring of the local church, high places. You've got your officers here, and these officers think they're a little higher, and those officers, then you've got all that pecking order, that we are the official board. Got to be very careful, because you set yourself up for wickedness to take a seat at the table. And unless one is willing to strive, and I would even use the word fight spiritually, and with integrity. I don't mean the fist fighting stuff, but with integrity, striving against that we are wrestling against. There's not going to be that kind of flourishing ministry, because we're still digging in to the root of the tree, and the sap is being drained. The energy is being drained from the base. And unless we are willing to look at the context of where we are, recognize that, yes, this is not the ideal, that we are in a context that one must vigorously, with systematic energy and intentionality, plan. And I think sometimes that's another weakness. We want results, but we don't want to spend the due diligence in planning and having that foundation that I've got to fight to get this foundation. The church is not just the lodge or a school system or any corporate structure, but the church is a different organism. It is a spiritual organism that was given directives by God. Clearly in Jesus, Matthew 28:20, 19, go, therefore, and teach, and making disciples. Go and teach, first mandate. And to do that, you don't get instantaneous fruit. That's the trench work that you do in this vigorous planning and this endeavors and fighting with these power structures and people in position who don't want to do, of helping them, teaching them, to help them understand that this is not about us. And so when you use those words wonderfully together, flourishing, I don't know of a church, small or large, that at the end of the day, they don't want to be a flourishing. Everybody wants to be a big church. Only 5,000 members in the community, but we want to have 1,000 in our church, and that's not going to happen. And but we can be healthy, and we must always strive for excellence. And to do that, you can have a thriving church and do wonderful things in ministry and flourish within the context that you're in. But it's going to take intentional planning, vigorous work, and the will to do the spiritual battles with the struggles for what's right and what's godly.
We've been encouraging people to think about what we call a formula for flourishing. And the formula roughly holds that if a pastor's leadership capacity plus service context builds ministry content, higher probability for flourishing. So the idea is you can't just drag and drop what somebody else did, but it's more organic. So you talk to us a little about how your context of service has informed your content of ministry in terms of your own journey.
For me, it starts with pastoral visioning and prayer. That before I would and have approached and presented, I've tried to spend personal time and diligence in making sure, as sure as can be, that this is God's will for us at this time. So as we begin to use the word pastoral leadership capacity, understanding our limitations, understanding our abilities, assessing our resources, both financial, both volunteerism, and community-based resources, assessing resources. Can we do as God has directed? Do we have the resources and the person power? Is there a commitment? So I think that, but try to assess our capacity and work within the capacity as pastor and offering leadership to what we have. I have 50 members. I don't have 500. I have 50 members. What's the capacity of these 50 members in this community where I am with the vision that God has placed upon our heart? So moving from capacity to context. Where am I? Where am I? I'm in a rural community. Where am I? I'm in an urban area. Where am I? I'm in a city with 400 churches. Where am I? For me, that I have to understand my context and be realistic about my context and the capacities that I have in the context that I find myself and called to do ministry. And it is out of that context, I move into the content, trying to logically follow your trend of thought, David, here. The content is not in absentia of my context and my capacity. All of us, regardless to how bright and gifted we are, we all have limitations. And I have to be honest about my limitations in the context that I'm in, lest I will lead in a way that doesn't have integrity. Some have three skills, some have 5, some have 7 talents. We don't all have this, but if I got 3, that's my capacity. I'm going to work with my 3 and not covet the 7. And then when I look at it flourishing, I'm excited because I know that we have done what we can do with the resources in the capacity and the context that we are in, and feel good about it, and not feel that I'm not doing as much as so-and-so. No, I don't have what so-and-so has. I think as clergy persons, it's important for us to be honest with ourselves about ourselves. 1, 2, to be grateful for the situation of ministry that God has placed us. I need to be grateful that I'm here and not here, coveting I ought to be over there. But being faithful right here. Be faithful. That's my mantra. Be faithful. Regardless, be faithful. Be faithful. We are called by God to be faithful. And as we practice that kind of faithfulness with that kind of honest integrity, striving, you've got to work. It's the other thing. You've got to work. You've got to work. I tell anyone, ministry is not, 8 to 5. It's not 40 hours. Say what you will or may. You've got to work. You've got to put in the hours and the time on your knees with God and with the people. You've got to work. And when you will do those kinds of things, then that spiritual element, that spiritual element will kick in and will do things with what you have that you can't imagine.
A word to our listeners. Lott Carey's Pilgrimages of Striving and Thriving podcast is funded by the Lilly Endowment through its Thriving in Ministry initiative. We'll be right back with more from the interview.
Since 1897, the Lott Carey Global Christian Missional Community has helped churches to extend the Christian witness around the world. We collaborate with indigenously led communities to bear good and faithful witness to Christ Jesus through ministries of evangelism, compassion, empowerment, and advocacy in Africa, Asia, the Caribbean, Europe, North America, Oceania, and South America. Together, we are touching lives with transforming love. You too can help to extend the Christian witness throughout the world. Visit us at lottcarey.org. That's LOTTCAREY.org. Thanks for praying for and investing in the good news globally through word and deed.
Welcome back to the Lott Carey podcast, Pilgrimages of Striving and Thriving. I'm Reverend Dr. Jacqueline Madison McQuarrie, the Learning Coordinator of Lott Carey's Thriving in Ministry program. Each week in this podcast, my colleague, Reverend Dr. David Emmanuel Goatley, interviews a prominent Black pastoral leader to gain insight for flourishing in ministry. Now back to more of his interview with Reverend Dr. Clifford A. Jones Sr., pastor of the Friendship Missionary Baptist Church in Charlotte, North Carolina.
You've been at the Friendship Church in Charlotte, if my memory serves me right, approaching 4 decades, which is a wonderful experience because there are people at the Friendship Church where they've not known another pastor, or if they had another pastor, it's a fading memory. But can you give us just one example of how being in a church in a city, that context, can you give us an example of some kind of a ministry that the Lord has called you all to because you're situated in a city like Charlotte?
Oh, where do I start? One, our Child Development Center. And so when I came, we expanded our child daycare center to become a 5-star child development center, one of the few 5-star centers in our city and county in providing care. So again, through the utilization of facilities. 2, we developed a CDC, Community Development Center, and we have a kitchen, a certified commercial kitchen in our church facilities that we pretty much use when we had homecoming or funeral or one of the auxiliaries wanted to have a meal. We had the health department inspect it and certify it, and we created a catering company so that we can now do catering and created jobs. And so rather than having someone bring in food, we do our own catering and our own cooking. Again, using capacity of what we have on site and facilities. Where do I stop?
Can you share with our listeners maybe an example of 2 of how your capacity as a leader has had to develop so that you could serve faithfully?
On the job training. Our academic institutions do a tremendous job in helping us to do all the academic things as it relates to research and study. But I find that they are amiss in helping prepare us to be pastors of local churches. I think there's still, as we talk now, still think there's a tremendous gap in helping prepare us for the local church. What's evolved? One, I had to realize that though I was seminary trained, there were persons that knew a lot more about the operating of the church than I did. It was an humbling lesson in terms of the local systems and systemics and dynamics that can determine whether your ministry will not only flourish, but survive, whether you will be able to stay long enough, develop the kind of tenure and relationships within the congregation that you will be able to stay long enough in order to be effective to do the things that God has called you to do. Had to learn patience, that things don't happen just because you have a vision and a dream. To get people to come along with you, beside you, not just behind you, but with you and under you and around you, to gird you, takes time to develop. It takes time to develop that kind of relationship of trust. They call you to be the minister. It takes years to become the pastor, where they trust you and will put their lives and their hearts in your hands and follow your leadership. I've had to learn patience. Another lesson I had to learn is that they could get along quite well without me. I had prided myself, and I believe in a strong work ethic, and that for a period of time I wasn't taking all of my vacation because I had things to do. I had tasks to do. I was pretty much a task-oriented person. I wanted to see this done, and I needed that, and too much of a hands-on person. I've had to learn another thing, to trust people to do things, because in a larger context, you can't do everything. And persons won't do it exactly as you want it done, but let them do it the best way that they can do it. and build that kind of capacity of a staff. But I had been working feverishly and to get things done. And I felt that I just had to be there and be there. And so one of our deacons asked me, he said, Pastor Jones, have you had your vacation yet? And I, with all honesty, I said, no, Deke, I said, I haven't been able to get away yet. I said, I just had, these things to do. He stopped. He looked at me, he said, Pastor? I said, yes. He said, I want you to know this church can get along without you. One of the best things he ever said to me. At the moment, I didn't appreciate it. My ego, but he was exactly right. The church, regardless to where it is and or its capacity to do whatever it can do, is an organism of God. I believe that with all of my heart. We have our land, we have our deeds, we have our steeples, but that organism, that's God's. We are placed there. Are you listening to me? As instruments of God for God's kingdom. It's not about, you've got to grow out of some of that stuff. It's not about you or who has the sweetest voice or, and all of that other kind of stuff. And I'm not fighting anything. But you've got to realize that this is God's and God has placed you there. You've got to believe that you are where the Lord has placed you and be faithful where the Lord has placed you and be faithful to his people and enjoy it. One of the things I find that too many of our colleagues don't get a real sense of joy and happiness. You talk, man, you hear all the sob stories of how horrible it is. No, you've got to learn to love this and enjoy it. You have to enjoy coming here. You have to enjoy the struggle. You have to enjoy the striving and the thriving. And the flourishing is just icing on the cake. But you've got to enjoy being down in the trenches and working through this with adversarial spirits and then see it come to fruition. And then they have to look and say, well, Rev, you were right. That's the joy of this. And it can happen, but again, you've got to trust God with it. This ministry, this church that we call Christian, it belongs to God. And we are only temporary instruments in the hand of God to do God's bidding in God's service. And yes, at the end of the day, we will stand before God and give an accounting. And I don't think sometimes our colleagues believe that, of how faithful we have been. Remember Matthew chapter 25, verses 31 through 46, Jesus talking to the crowd and some of the, the goats and the sheep, we get all, the core of that was, in so much as you have done it unto the least of these, you've done it unto me. Final thing that I'll say here, the least of these is learning how to be a pastor who loves Thomas when he doubts, Simon Peter when he curses and swears and walks away, and Judas when he kisses you. It's easy to be the pastor of Mary and Martha. But the challenge is to love Judas and Peter and Thomas and Philip. And every church, regardless of location and size, has a Simon Peter, a Judas, a Thomas, and a Philip.
That's rich, Doc. What's the best advice you've received about pastoral leadership?
The best advice, be faithful, trust God, and you have to be a Christian. I shouldn't have to say that, but a pastor ought to be a Christian. what are you talking about? How you say something like that? I'm serious. You have to believe it yourself. You have to believe. You have to move beyond the academic and classroom and stuff. And I think it was Albert Schweitzer that in his book on the quest for the historical Jesus, when he was talking in that, he talked about how in his lab or laboratory, he would take Jesus apart and look at him thoroughly. But in the pulpit, he preached him crucified and resurrected. You've got to believe it. I love the academic, and, I like to banter with it when we get together and we start talking, and I love all of that. It's stimulating. But at the end of the day, I've got to believe when I stand up and say, early Sunday morning, God raised him from the dead. I've got to believe that in my core. And I've got to be faithful to the calling wherein I am called as a servant. The Greek doulos, I'm called slave. I'm really a slave for Christ. And so what advice would I give? Be faithful. Be a good student. Don't stop studying. You need to read. You've got to read everything. I mean, literally everything. Read your Bible, not just when you're looking for a sermon, but spend time just sitting down and reading the canon of scriptures. Of course, read current events, read cultural things, read your history. You need to be prepared when it's time to preach. As a friend of mine told me who passed away, be effective, not the best. We want to be the best or better than. No. Be effective. God, Spirit blesses effectiveness.
Dr. Clifford A. Jones, Sr., the lead pastor of the Friendship Missionary Baptist Church in Charlotte, North Carolina. You've been a blessing to pastors across the country and around the world in your ministry over time and in this, in sharing your wisdom today. So thanks so much for the time to talk with us.
Thank you, my brother. May the Lord ever bless and keep you in his care and keep doing good. Keep doing good. And thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you for joining us today for Pilgrimages of Striving and Thriving, a weekly podcast from Lott Carey as we listen in on conversations with prominent pastoral thought leaders. Join us next week for a conversation with a new guest and fresh insights. Wisdom from the Black Church for the whole church. I'm Reverend Dr. Jacqueline Madison McQuarrie. Pilgrimages of Striving and Thriving is produced in partnership with Good Faith Media. Music by Makita McQuarrie. Share the word with those who need to hear it. Pilgrimages of Striving and Thriving, wherever you get your podcasts. Also listen online at lottcarey.org.